Do you love books but don't have time to read them? Do you wish you could listen to your favorite stories while driving, working out, or doing chores? If so, you need Audible, the world's largest library of audiobooks and podcasts. With Audible, you can enjoy unlimited access to thousands of titles across genres and categories from bestsellers to classics, thrillers, romance, fiction, and nonfiction. You can also discover new and exclusive content from Audible Originals, featuring original stories and performances by celebrities and authors. Plus, you can download your audiobooks and podcasts offline for listening anywhere, anytime, on any device. And with Audible Plus, you can get even more benefits, such as unlimited listening to select audiobooks and podcasts, free exchanges and returns, and a 30-day free trial. So what are you waiting for? Join Audible today and start your listening adventure. Visit the show notes to support the show and get your free Audible trial today. Thank you for your support.
And now, on with the show.
Gentlemen, what's your favorite big movie monster? Tom, let's start with you.
It's pretty simple for me. I hate to be a bit of a basic bitch here, but, it's Godzilla. He's a surly lizard that stomps around cities and likes to destroy things. I can relate to his mood swings very easily. When I go out drinking, I can get some atomic breath. And, like in King of the Monsters, I very much related to the fact that sometimes he just needs to go and take a nap and recharge. In his case, he goes to Atlantis to recharge, which is, I feel like more people should talk about how fucking wild King of the Monsters is. Great movie, guys. Joe Bob recommends. But yeah, Godzilla's my favorite big movie monster. He's the man.
I'm going to answer this setting aside the kind of simian subject of today's episode. If I had to put that aside, because that obviously has my heart. But aside from that, I think second place for me is the giant squid in 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. I think that when you talk about kind of the missing link between Beast 20,000 Fathoms and Kong to Godzilla, I mean that squid in the Disney 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea is menacing, is scary. Like now I watch it, it's just cool and impressive. But I remember having nightmares about that as a kid, and the way it latches onto the Nautilus. Like there's something about that squid and the brilliance of the design, the art direction of the Nautilus sub that it attacks. That you just look at that squid and go, "Oh, this creature was tailor made to destroy this thing," which is so cool. So. Yeah, aside from Kong, I think it's the squid in 20,000 Leagues.
I want to throw my hot take in here too, that even though it might not necessarily be my favorite, I do have a soft spot for the Cloverfield monster and Cloverfield at large, primarily because there was like a 6-month period. And again, I'm like in junior high at this point where like nobody really knew what that movie was going to be and if it was going to be a remake of like a Godzilla or a King Kong. So I don't know, that period of what is this going to be, and then seeing it and being like, oh, okay, it's not as cute, but fine. I'll always appreciate Cloverfield for its place in cinema, I guess.
I saw it. It's a lion. It's huge.
Every year since 1989, the Library of Congress has selected 25 films to add to the National Film Registry. The criteria? The films must be culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant.
Each week on You're Missing Out, we take a look at one of these films to try and get to the heart of why they were selected and why they still matter.
This week, we're joined by filmmaker and author Graham Skipper to discuss the 1933 classic, King Kong.
Our guest today is a filmmaker and the author of Godzilla, the official guide to the King of the Monsters. Graham Skipper joins us today on the show to talk King Kong. Graham, thank you so much for joining us.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Welcome, welcome, welcome. We're excited to have you, man. Big fan of your appearances on Screen Drafts.
Yeah, thanks. Some people are fans, some people not so much.
The reigning king of getting vetoed, Graham Skipper, big fan. So yes, thank you. And yeah, you're a Godzilla boy. I love a good Godzilla fan. Not here for Godzilla though, sadly. Little too early for the Monsterverse.
Yeah,
to get into
but before that, we're
registry.
pre-Monsterverse, pre-Monsters. Really, this is kind of the first.
Yeah, but with the
Yes.
tangentially related, they do meet up multiple times,
100%,
so that's exciting.
100%, yeah.
That's one of the things that was cool. I was saying this before we got on mic. I was saying this to you before we got on mic, I should say, and which is so often, with these films, like I'm always looking for an opportunity when we're like trying to get people on, like, oh, can I make a clear one-to-one here, right? And you're someone who has been on a list of ours of like, oh, people we'd love to get on the show. But when you had this book, I was like, well, here we go. There's a, it's a perfect tie-in. The kind of path from Kong to Godzilla is a pretty clear line, to the point where, again, they just decide in the third Godzilla movie what should happen. I guess he should fight King Kong. you know. Uh, so I was very excited to get you on to talk about this. I think it's gonna be a lot of fun.
Thanks. Yeah. I'm excited to be here, and yeah, I mean it's funny how King Kong and Godzilla are so sort of intertwined. I mean, obviously they're both giant monsters, and yes, they both do meet up. But I mean, really, without King Kong, we wouldn't have Godzilla. Like Tomoyuki Tanaka, who created the Godzilla franchise, he was a huge King Kong nut. Both him and Eiji Tsuburaya, who did all the special effects, and it was that really drove the project forward. Was their love of of King Kong and of the Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, and so really, I think they were both destined to meet eventually, just because King Kong was so important to the birth of Godzilla and what would become the world's longest running film franchise.
You mentioned the fans of King Kong. This is one of those movies. We're talking about the National Film Registry here, and they're picking films that they deem historically, culturally, or aesthetically significant. That can mean a number of different things. We've gone from watching some of the movies that are the Stone Cold classics, like your Citizen Kane, your Gone with the Wind, to movies that are formative and influential to some people, right? That most people haven't seen. We did earlier this season, we did David Holzman's Diary, which is, I think I said it on the episode, like the Velvet Underground of movies, where not a lot of people saw it, but everybody who saw it picked up a camera and made a movie. King Kong is like the middle of that Venn diagram, in that it is a popular blockbuster, right? That was an era-defining blockbuster, but also so many of the filmmakers that we love now and the films that came later talk about seeing King Kong as a landmark moment for them, right?
Sure.
The Godzilla folks, Harryhausen, James Cameron, like all of these people like talk about that moment in that movie that just kind of launched all of their interest in what cinema could do.
Well, yeah, and I mean, even talking to like just a regular film fan, I mean, I think you'd be hard pressed to find anybody that doesn't know who King Kong is. Even before they may have seen, Godzilla versus Kong, or before they may have seen even the '70s King Kong. Everybody knows who King Kong is. I mean, speaking from personal experience, like my introduction to the Godzilla franchise was, I was a kid. I was probably 5 years old. I was watching on my grandparents' HBO channel. They advertised King Kong versus Godzilla was the next movie, and somehow, being like 5, I already knew who King Kong and Godzilla were, which is what made me go, well, I think I'll like both of them, so I'll watch this. And of course, it made me fall in love with the franchise. But that's kind of the power of King Kong and of this particular movie, is that everybody knows it. I would wager that most of the people, at least in America, that know who King Kong is, have probably not seen this movie. It's just such a it's such a part of the fabric of like American cinematic history that I feel it's sort of like Citizen Kane, or like Gone with the Wind, or like Wizard of Oz, like these movies that people like know about and are just like understood to be the best, but people maybe haven't seen. But what I hope through this podcast is that people actually take time to go and watch this movie, because it fucking holds up.
Yeah.
It holds up. It is a great movie. It's exciting. It's fun. I can understand people that like watch something like, I don't know, Murnau's Nosferatu, and are maybe like appreciate it, but aren't like emotionally invested in it. Like they appreciate visuals or whatever,
Yeah.
but maybe they're not like emotionally invested. This movie, I mean, you're hard pressed not to cry at the end, even today. and this is a 90-year-old film. And I think that's something really, really special. And I hope that this can be a movie that maybe is a bit of a gateway for especially the younger generation to accept and honor that older films can be good too.
And
And you know, it's interesting because, like you said, you would probably assume most Americans probably haven't even seen the original King Kong, but we have that idea of King Kong in our minds. I would say probably similarly with Godzilla. I feel like most Americans know of Godzilla from the sequels that they watched on, like, 10 o'clock movies on Saturday nights or whatever, but not really the original.
Yeah.
It's interesting though, because I know that there are sequels in the King Kong franchise, but this is almost a really fallow period for the Big Ape in that there's not really many movies for people to know. Nothing really comes out in the 90s. We don't really get King Kong back into like a big mainstream consciousness until Peter Jackson does it. What, 14 years after this is inducted into the National Film Registry. After that, it's 10, 11 years, 12 years, something like that, until Skull Island comes out, that a character cannot be as prolific as Kong and still just everybody knows who King Kong is. You don't even need to really be inundated with King Kong cinema to just know, like, oh yeah, the big ape that likes blonde ladies and climbs buildings. Like, yeah, we know that guy.
Well, yeah, like when Peter Jackson, came out with his King Kong, there was no need for the movie to explain who King Kong is. Like everybody just kind of knew.
Yeah.
And I do have to say that while in the West, you're right, we had just a void of King Kong films. In Japan, Toho actually got the rights to King Kong, and they produced a few King Kong films. King Kong versus Godzilla being, of course, the most famous one, and that was actually a gigantic blockbuster.
Yeah.
That was actually responsible for reviving the Godzilla franchise on its own. But it's interesting to me that the tradition of Kong, because even in Japan, I mean, it's not like he had 30 films or something. I mean, they made, I don't know, got 4 or 5 movies with him, maybe, I can't remember.
Well, there's Kong Godzilla. Then there's the one afterward. Was it King Kong Escapes
King
with
Kong
Mechanic
Escapes.
Kong?
Yeah, King
But
Kong
it's
Escapes, which is fun.
well, there's the cartoon series. That's, I think, the main thing in Japan, right? Is the
You're right,
Toei
right.
makes because that's what Mechanic Kong comes from, right? It's the little boy is friends with Godzilla. I mean, sorry, friends with Kong, and then the Doctor Who is the enemy and all that, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's all, and they really took it and ran with it,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's interesting to me that even in Japan, where they did revive the franchise, still you have like so many years in between, and you have this just general international understanding of who King Kong is and what he's about, and that primarily he is a sympathetic character.
Yeah.
Like you look at like Godzilla, right? And Godzilla is sometimes sympathetic, sometimes not. And that's part of the fun of the franchise. With King Kong, I mean, baked into his very character is that he's sympathetic.
Yeah.
He's like Frankenstein's monster. I mean, that's how
Yeah.
I've always kind of looked at him. You have King Kong as the monster that that doesn't want to kill but does, that is driven by love, and then you have, I mean, just a few years later, I mean, what was, like 2 or 3 years later, you have Frankenstein that comes out.
Yeah,
I
which
think
we're also covering this season.
Oh,
well,
nice.
Frankenstein's the same year.
Is it the
year as
same year?
33? No, it's gotta be-
Actually, no, because the Universal monster stuff was like really early. Like it was.
Well, Dracula was 31. Dracula, I know, was 31.
I think Frankenstein actually might have been 31 also. I'm double checking this.
yeah, double check that, but because it's definitely not. the
Yeah,
same
Frankenstein
year.
was 31.
Frankenstein also was 31. Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's like it's this interesting kind of cultural thing, and I don't know what was going on at the time to make it this way, but to have these sympathetic characters that were these monsters, we were wanting to side with them. And I think more than any other movie, King Kong does that, and it does that so much more deftly. I mean, because of if no other reason than the fact that we're dealing with a stop motion character. And this is not just a monster. This is not just, a dinosaur that's attacking people. This is it's the main character of our movie.
Yeah.
Um, it's and so, like, even from just a technical aspect, it's just incredible to look at that and to see what they were able to do.
And I think a big thing with Kong in like comparison to Frankenstein, why we are so easily able to empathize with Kong and still do, is that unlike Frankenstein, unlike Godzilla, or any of these other monsters, King Kong is just King Kong. He's not, you know, made by someone. He's not an accident. Kong is just who he is. Kong is just living on his island, and the thing that's going to end up killing him comes to him. He's an innocent in all of this. Like you said, he's not knocking the natives around, and he's picking people out of buildings and throwing them out because he's looking for Fay Ray. He's just a ape who's brought into trouble, who doesn't want any trouble, and you kind of have to feel bad for the guy, which I at the time had to be very relatable. The Great Depression's going on. Everybody's just living their lives, and this big fucking problem just comes and knocks everyone's life out. World War One was 13, 14 years ago. World War Two is about to ramp up soon. All that craziness in Europe is kicking off. And even today, COVID hits. We're locked up away. People can't afford to live anymore. All this trouble just keeps coming to us that we're not even asking for, like Kong.
Well, but I think the difference there, and this is what I think separates Kong and Godzilla too. If you look at and I think that sometimes people mistake. Now it's pretty well known amongst most people that there's a lot of depth and symbolism to that original Godzilla film and what it represents with regards to, the Japanese feelings on the nuclear attacks and all that. And sometimes I think people mistakenly think that Kong is more simple, and that they take that ending line of "'Twas beauty killed the savage beast" and think that's the moral of the movie, instead of realizing, no, it's this guy Denham repeating the thing he said 2 times previously to kind of absolve himself. Where this movie comes from, I mean, I think that when you look at the first Godzilla, and I'm just speaking for myself here, obviously we have the guy who wrote the book on it here, so I don't want to talk too much about Godzilla, but Godzilla is Japan reacting to a thing that happened to them. That the bomb dropping, this thing that kind of, like Tom's suggesting with certain things, like this happened. What's so fascinating about King Kong, the one of the inciting incidents from Marion C. Cooper, and we'll talk a lot about Marion C. Cooper, who's a fascinating guy, just a wild life he lived. But one of the inciting incidents from Marion C. Cooper was that a friend of his brought Komodo dragons back to America and brought them to the Bronx Zoo. Because remember, as Tom alluded with World War I, like, America and Americans are now in touch with the world in a much bigger way than they had been before. Somebody brought back Komodo dragons to the Bronx Zoo, and they were so exotic and so entrancing, and they were like prehistoric creatures and what have you, and then they died in the zoo. And Marion C. Cooper was profoundly affected by this because he said it was civilization that killed them. So what he's doing with Kong, I agree with you, Tom, about like how people felt during the Depression, but the interesting thing about Kong and what the movie's about and what Cooper is getting at is Kong is not a creature that just shows up out of the water, right? We did this to ourselves. Americans arrogantly, took a boat out to Skull Island, interfered with some ceremonies, could have just gotten footage, but then decided, let's actually take the creature back with us and put him on Broadway. Like,
I mean, it's kind of clear watching it now with 90 years of hindsight, how other than Anne, everyone in the movies is kind of an unlikable, arrogant asshole.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not in a way, not like the way the movie's unwatchable, but you're like, Jack's a misogynistic dick to her, like, the whole movie, and then just presumptively, it's like, oh, I love you, you want to get married? The captain's kind of just this doddering old man who's just like, yeah, I don't know, the natives are saying some shit, whatever, let's go do whatever we got to do. Denham's obviously the biggest dick in the movie, where he causes all of this trouble, lying to everyone. He comes up with the plan to bring King Kong back. The Americans are not portrayed as particularly smart or caring people, in my view, at least. It was kind of striking watching it. in prep for this, where I was like, wow, they're kind of unlikable.
Now, before we get further into the film, because we usually open with this, and we got so into the discussion, before we get any further into it, let's talk about what the Library of Congress had to say. Here's what the National Film Registry said about King Kong. Since it first opened, King Kong has been an audience favorite, initially giving the troubled RKO much-needed money to finance future projects. It has come to epitomize one of Hollywood's best attempts at horror fantasy. Layered with obvious moralizing, the story has taken on the significance of a modern folktale. Adventurer and movie director Carl Denham, Robert Armstrong, takes an unknowing crew and newly found star, Ann Darrow, Fay Ray, on a mysterious voyage to the lush prehistoric jungles of Skull Island, where giant creatures lurk, including the gargantuan ape, Kong. Captivated by Anne, he carries her off, the crew scrambling after them, until he's finally subdued and taken to New York for exhibition. Directors Marion C. Cooper and Ernest B. Schoedstack used Willis O'Brien's spectacular stop-motion effects to develop a series of tumultuous action scenes, both on the island and in Manhattan, culminating with Kong's famous ascent of the Empire State Building. So that's what the registry said during the induction, and I do think it's interesting, that hints or touches on what you were talking about at the beginning, Graham, that people haven't seen the film but know it. It is one of those things where King Kong has transcended into an American folktale, right? The idea of King Kong and the story of King Kong maybe occupies the space now that like a Paul Bunyan or a Windwagon Smith did like 100 or 200 years ago.
Well, sure. I mean, it's like you go to Universal Studios and they have the King Kong experience, right? Or I seem to remember when I was a kid and we went to New York on vacation, and I maybe I'm imagining this or conflating this with some other thing, but I seem to remember there being an inflatable King Kong on the side of the Empire State, like that just being a thing, and somehow you just know King Kong climbs the Empire State Building.
Yeah.
And it's a cultural touchstone. It's just a thing of American culture, and it really is kind of incredible. I mean, it's you know, like more people know that King Kong climbs the Empire State Building than they know that Rosebud is the sled in
Yeah.
Citizen Kane, right? Like, spoiler alert.
Yeah.
But like I don't know. It's something. There's something so captivating about Kong that that makes people, and maybe it's because he's a mammal. He's an animal with like, because I think about this often of like, why do people kind of look at Kong overall as more sympathetic than Godzilla? And I wonder if it's because he has fur. I wonder if it's because his affection is more specific and focused towards a human, like as opposed to being more like metaphorical or something like Godzilla is. But it really is incredible. I mean, from being a young kid and going to the King Kong ride at Universal, it's like, how did I know what King Kong did? I don't know. I just always have. It's amazing.
To that point about the sympathetic, do you think part of it, I mean, one of the things that this movie does so well, the animation of Kong, right, is so human. It's so well done. They give him such a personality. I mean, later this season, we're going to do Gertie the Dinosaur, which is the first animated film to give a character personality, right? That carries through to Kong, where it's not just the fact that he moves, but it gives him little things. The fight with the T-Rex, right? The fact that that's modeled after the way that people would actually brawl, right? The movements feel natural. But then after he kills the T-Rex, that they have him lean down and just play with the jaw a bit. Like that was expensive to animate. That took a lot of time, and you didn't necessarily, air quotes, need it for the movie. But by watching him do that, you're like, oh, this thing has personality. This thing has thoughts and feelings and emotions. It's not just a killing machine. But to your point about why more sympathetic than Godzilla, I wonder if part of that has to do with the fact that Kong is mortal, right? That Godzilla, when you watch the first Godzilla film, Godzilla appears, and the whole crux of the movie is going, how the hell do we stop this thing, right? Like, this is an unstoppable killing machine. Kong, if there is no gassing him and taking him to New York, right? If there is no chaining him up, maybe he's not as sympathetic because you're like, oh, he could hold his own. but it is the fact that he is vulnerable, and it is the
Sure.
fact that like he can be defeated and destroyed that we're like, oh, why are you fucking with him then? Like, why leave him alone? You know?
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And yeah, I mean, you're right. He gets gassed, he gets taken, by these people that don't seem to be that smart.
No.
Like they don't
Yeah.
seem to be, it's not like an elite group of scientists have like gone there to that island to go find him and capture him. Yeah, so I think you're right. Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And I mean, yeah, he's vulnerable and he pretty quickly becomes the victim. The movie doesn't make any qualms about like, at least in my opinion, about making Kong like the super evil character. Once Denham and company decide we're gonna take him, and they take him, in my mind, I don't know how you could see him as anything but a sympathetic character.
Yeah.
Now I don't know what 1933 audiences thought, and that might have been different.
I can tell
Um,
you what certain 1933 audiences thought, because this movie was very controversial in one country. Who wants to
okay,
guess?
I mean,
Denmark.
Over in Germany, the
interesting,
Nazis were not thrilled with this movie.
huh?
They were concerned about the film because they thought viewers would, number one, actually believe it happened. And number two, they felt like the representation of the ape with the blonde woman suggested some bad things. Y'all can fill in the blanks why. And they
Lord.
said the movie would only would have a serious effect on both psychopaths and women. That's how they lumped it together. So they retitled the movie King Kong: An American Fable before they released it, because they're like, if we
It's
call
pretty
it
great.
a fable, people will they won't think it's real. And Kong does represent something interesting even then, which is like when you think about, not to get too into, this was not a Nazi podcast like episode. We're not getting into that, but it
You
is a
say
thing.
that every episode. Look, this is not a Nazi podcast.
I always have to pull him back, and he
Yeah.
always gets mad. And so now this is his bit where he has
mean-
to always go,
I mean, in
"This is
fairness-
not a Nazi podcast," with that sarcasm in his voice. I get it.
Not to get too into it, Graham, but I'm glad we warned you, because you come in and there's one pale, blonde-haired, blue-eyed guy and one bald, tatted-up guy with tattoos. There's got to be a part of you that sees us on camera and goes, "Oh no, is this one of those shows?" But the thing about that's interesting is, like, when you look at like even film censorship in Nazi Germany, like there were so many movies that they just said, it's not coming here, it's not coming here. It was very easy for them to do that, but certain things were so undeniable that they were like, fuck, we got to do it. And Kong, I mean, I believe that even Hitler watched King Kong multiple times. It's this movie that just has this, and I think that's part of why it stuck around in the culture, even when there weren't making more Kong movies, is that King Kong is, for its day, kind of like Star Wars is. Pretend there were no sequels or anything like that. Just this effect of like, everybody who saw King Kong, if somebody told them, I haven't seen it, they go, well, you got to see it.
Yeah.
Like there's nothing cool about saying you haven't seen it. It's just like, no, it's a good time. It's a spectacle. You got to fucking see it.
Well, I feel like I say this all the time on the show, but it's like this is 6 years after the Jazz Singer. Sound is just a new thing, and we're cinema's evolving, and then 6 years after the Jazz Singer blows people's minds, you get this movie where you get a pretty convincing giant ape stomping around Manhattan. That's got to be something everyone's like, fuck, you have to see this. You can only get this on the big screen unless you wait 90 years and wait to see it on Broadway, and
Which we did.
And then you can actually see it in person.
Well, and I mean, to speak also to the the newness of sound cinema, like there's a reason why Fay Wray's Scream is so iconic. Like this is essentially the first movie where we get that kind of screaming that is still effective today, and I can only imagine what it must have been like. And certainly we had Frankenstein, we'd had Dracula, we'd had these early Universal films. But there's something a lot more visceral to me about this movie than those films. Those films are a bit more stately, right? Those films are a bit more, like nobody could, you could never accuse those filmmakers of making like, oh, this is real, this really happened. But I can see why early, the same way as like audiences, supposedly jumped out of the way during the general when the train is
Yeah.
coming towards you in the screen, right? I can see why people would see this and go, "Is this real?" Because it's very very convincing. And when I think just the sound of Fay Ray's screaming, I mean it brings a lot of parallels to me of like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which to me is the greatest movie ever made. I'm not saying that ironically; that's my favorite film of all time. I do see a lot of parallels between King Kong and Leatherface, but we'll leave that for we can talk
Oh, I
about that
could see
later.
that.
Yeah.
I mean that the people just keep coming to his house. It's not his problem. They just keep
Hey,
showing up.
they break in. You know.
Um, you know, uh, he's trying to just keep to himself. But seriously, I think that it's the impact of King Kong being a part of this transitional period between silent film and sound film, I think is really important. And I think it's also striking to me as a horror fan that really these movies that bridge that gap, they're all horror films.
I mean, it makes sense, because horror and, King Kong and the Universal stuff, what they're dealing in is pure cinema, like the only kind of effect you can get on the screen. And these filmmakers are figuring that out of like, oh, we can get this kind of reaction you can't get reading a book or seeing a play.
Yeah.
And to your point of like, yeah, we had these Universal movies beforehand that had violence in them. In those, like the violence was off screen or implied. In King Kong, he's killing things in front of us. He's picking people up and putting them in his mouth and chewing on them. He's throwing people off of buildings. He's, taking the tree and shaking these guys off, and we see their bodies fall to their death and slam on the ground like, well, they were rag dolls, but like rag dolls. There's a visceral, dirty quality to this movie that, I mean, we weren't really getting at the time, especially in those Universal movies.
And I think the reason for a lot of that, and this comes back to the idea of the sound too. I mean, the sound, not just the Fay Wray scream, but the score itself. I mean, Max Steiner's score for this movie is revolutionary in its own way because, as opposed to the Universal monster movies, where yes, they had scores, right? Where
Yes.
they had scores that were like, oh well, I mean, but there's a reason why when we think of Dracula, we still think of like Toccata and Fugue. We think of songs that were not written for that movie. Max Steiner's score is written for King Kong, written for specific beats. Skull Island has a distinct sound. That's all Marion C. Cooper. Marion C. Cooper, we could do like 2 hours on just this guy's life. It is wild. He's a champion boxer. He fought in like 3 wars. He flew planes. He was an adventurer. And when we talk about that visceral quality of this movie, that is all Marion C. Cooper because he lived this. The same way we love to talk about in the show the directors who went over in World War II and then came back and their movies have a totally different energy to them. That's Marion C. Cooper. His movies were all about, he started out making like ethnographic films. Him and Ernest Schoedsack made a film called Grass, A Nation's Battle for Life. And then they later made a film called Chang, which was one of the first Best Picture nominees. And with Chang, he not only used real villagers to capture, life here, he wanted to film an elephant stampede. And he was like, well, filming an elephant stampede just with a camera, the audience isn't going to feel that. Instead, he developed a technique. I want to make sure I get the name right here, called Magnoscope, where the film had a certain frame, right? Like a smaller square frame that you were watching it the whole time and presumably just assumed that's what the movie looks like. And then when the elephants were stampeding, the frame gets bigger as they're coming to you. So you feel like they're rushing at you. And people were, because this is pre-sound, people were behind the screen with timpani drums, banging them to make you feel like the elephants are coming at you. So Cooper is all about trying to make this stuff feel more real and make the audience feel what he experienced as a world traveler, as, that. And Carl Denham is based on Cooper and his own experiences, right? Like he's calling himself out with Denham because he is the type to travel the world. And this goes on forever. I mean, Cooper ends up being the director of This Is Cinerama, when they create the new Cinerama format, and he's like, let's strap a camera to the front of a propeller plane and fly through mountains to make people feel like they're flying. And everybody went, Marion, this is the only Cinerama camera we have. If you crash this plane, we've got nothing. And he said, I'm going to do it anyway. And he did. But anyway, that's all to say. The reason this feels so different, I think, is the fact that as opposed to the people making the Universal Monster movies, who I love, this is not in any way saying like James Whale is bad at all. I love it. He's doing a different thing, right? He's telling a story from a book. Cooper is trying to make you feel what he felt as a traveler, right? He's doing what Jacques Cousteau would later do with his underwater documentaries, which is just, I want you to feel like you're somewhere you are at, you know?
This has a much bigger guerrilla feel.
Yeah.
That not gorilla, but guerrilla
Yeah.
feel than a lot of those movies do. I mean, for sure. It feels. It feels like a documentary, and it still feels like that today when you watch it. Even though you know that these creatures are done through stop motion and all that stuff, it's just shot very realistically. And I mean, yeah, like the moment you talked about where he sort of plays with T-Rex's jaw, it's just all very natural, and even the accidental aspect of like Kong's fur moving between shots. I mean, that was just done because they had the fur moved between the shots and they couldn't control that, but it gives it a life. It allows it to like breathe. Yeah, the movie even today, I mean, to me, it still feels documentarian like that. And so I can only imagine what it must have felt like back in 1933.
Well, I mean, I just think about like how difficult the Stegosaurus scene had to have been to just conceive and then to shoot, because it's even now still like stunning to watch how it's stunning a wide. The Stegosaurus charges at them, they shoot it, then they start moving, and the camera moves with them, and the effect never breaks. You know in your mind it has to be like, okay, there's a screen, and these guys are in front of a screen, and they're walking towards a screen, and it's all optical effects, but the illusion never breaks. It's astounding that they were able to think, all right, how do we do this, and then to do it. It's really mind-blowing and adds to that, guerrilla filmmaking style, that grittiness, like I was saying before, that you don't really get. This is very in the muck kind of movie.
Yeah, and I mean the inventiveness of these guys back in the early 30s, late 20s is just like unparalleled. I mean, one, cinema is still new, and
Yeah.
as a result, they're having to quite literally build the things that they are trying to accomplish. And as a result, it all still plays. It all still reads.
And I mean, they're building the language of cinema in front of our eyes, as much as Dracula and Frankenstein may not be as, technologically impressive as King Kong, they are building the language. Dracula was designed to be a silent film, and then they said, well, hey, we can make more money if it's sound. We're taking a big risk. Let's do it. They're literally writing it. And like, Mike brought up before, this is pretty much the first movie with a score written for the movie, written to heighten the effects, specific music cues. It's even now, like, you can, if you want to quibble about little things, acting style, whatever, like it feels like you're watching people dangling on a tightrope, not knowing if anything that they're making up as they go is going to actually work. And 90 years later, it does. Like, it's crazy.
Well, and that's the interesting thing, is there's so many things that a constant point of contention, I think, on this show and a lot of podcasts that deal with old movies is the conversation of remakes, right? And the back and forth of like, is it better to be more explicit about things in modern day, or did they do it better back then? One of the things that makes this movie so interesting, and I also think adds to that, that verisimilitude that it has, is the fact that it's been remade, right? Dino De Laurentiis did a remake, Peter Jackson did a remake. Part of the reason that those were not, I mean, you could talk about how well they were received box office-wise or critically at the time, right? But part of the reason those have not at all supplanted the original is that neither one, when they've made changes from what the original movie was, neither one has been greeted with people going, well, I get why you changed that, right? There hasn't been much where, like, nobody turned around after the De Laurentiis one and went, oh, the World Trade Center instead of the Empire State Building. Well, that's an improvement, right? You don't have that. There's very little fat to trim, and also a thing I think that works so well. Talking about horror, right? I mean, one of the modern subgenres of horror is the found footage movie, right? And why so few found footage movies really work, as the complaint often gets raised, is that it's very hard to get people to make decisions that people would actually make, right? You see this a lot with like why they are still holding on to the camera or why they're doing this and that. Part of what I love about this film, nobody is making a decision in it that it's not the decision I would make necessarily, but shit just happened. Like the idea that Denham just gets to the island with the idea of filming the ape and then randomly on a whim goes, fuck it, you got gas, let's just bring him back to New York. It's a dumb decision, but it's a lot easier to buy that than if you decide to, remake this and make him essentially like Bishop and Alien going, well, the plan was always to get to Skull Island and bring, you know what I'm saying? Like, everybody in this movie is just, none of them are particularly bright, but they're making decisions where you're like, okay, I could see how a person would do this.
Yeah, well, it's all very straightforward.
Yeah.
It's all very like all these characters, including Kong, are just doing things that are immediately in front of them. And that's what they care about.
It's a very reactive movie. I mean, once they get to the island, it's all reaction from everybody. Yeah, I mean, like, Kong gets into his predicament because Jack saves Anne, and he gets pissed off and storms the wall and starts attacking them, and then he gets knocked out and dragged to New York. And from there, he's reacting. Denham says he thinks you're attacking her, and so he starts freaking the fuck out, starts looking for her, trying to protect her, and gets himself killed. It really is, it may not be a tight 90, it's a tight 100, but it's still very lean and just like, yeah, here's what we're doing. We're shooting a movie. Oh, now we're on an island. Oh, there's a big ape. Oh, shit, we got to save the girl. Oh, no, the ape's loose in the city. It's not much, math you have to do in your brain to kind of just roll with this movie. It's like, yeah, okay, I get it.
And there's nothing where, like, I was thinking about this watching it, and I don't want to turn this into like, well, today you'd have to do blah, 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 blah. But the fact that Denham is just like, well, we're going to an island. I found this actress. And they go, well, where are we going? And 20 minutes in, he pulls out the map and goes, this is Skull Island. I bought this map off of somebody. We're going there. And that there was no temptation like there would be now to go, well, obviously we need to start the movie with Denham going into some village and finding the map. No, you don't need any of that. The movie just like from minute one, Marion C. Cooper assumes if you're here to see the movie King Kong, you're gonna do the necessary buy-ins to enjoy the movie King Kong. I don't need to win you over on, like, the logic of the giant ape. Like, you're here for it, just come enjoy this thing.
Unless you are a member of the Third Reich, you are not going to
Yes,
be
that's true.
looking
That's
for
true.
strict realism
That's true.
and emotional honesty from King Kong.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, it's funny because, the 76 remake changes a lot. I mean, the basic idea is the same, but like a lot is different. But then Peter Jackson, he adds a lot of character and all sorts of stuff. But if you actually watch it, he kind of just stuck to the even more micro level details, and it's interesting because it gets back to that thing of like how omnipresent Kong is in the popular culture that they remade it twice. Kind of did the same thing, different varying degrees. But as whatever you want to argue about the quality of either, they stuck in. People can at least remember those and talk about those. And nobody's really talking about King Kong Escapes or King Kong Lives or Son of Kong.
I mean,
it's funny
I would happily talk about Linda Hamilton putting Kong's brain into a robot body and finding a wife. I'll talk about that all day, every day.
I know we would, because we're all freaks, and that's fine. But it's funny that it's kind of until the Monsterverse, this recent WB Monsterverse, that any movie deviates from the structure of a Kong movie and is actually remembered and actually like well received. Like for all intents and purposes, King Kong saved cinema after COVID. As much as Top Gun Maverick last year did it too, but like that was the first movie where people were like, will people actually go to the movies again? And it was, no matter who you are, you want to see a big lizard and a big ape, just beat the shit out of each other and then team up to fight a robot, or as a character in the 30s, we would say a robot.
But yeah, I
King
mean,
Kong saved cinema. He helped move cinema into the sound era,
with
into
Godzilla,
the big spectacle era.
with Godzilla, he
With
saved
Godzilla.
cinema.
Yes. Hey, listen, Godzilla's my boy. I'm with you, Graham.
I just
Godzilla's
had
my
to
boy.
say, I just had to throw it in there.
But to this day, it's just funny that it took almost 80, 90 years for a successful King Kong movie to come out that isn't just, we got to get a blonde on top of a building. It's like, all right, well, I guess it's because it's hard to like make another story of King Kong, or it shouldn't have been. But also,
Son
like,
of Kong sure as shit tried.
yeah, but it's also like, well, fuck, this first story's so iconic. Like, what else can we even do that people will even accept?
To your point, like the 70s Kong and the Peter Jackson King Kong, I mean, like you said, they kept the essential same storyline. They just tried to up the ante on the special effects.
Yeah.
To varying degrees of success. Like I think both of them actually work in terms of expanding on the effects of the original. I actually quite like the Peter Jackson King Kong. I'm a bit of an apologist for that movie.
I got it on right now.
But yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting your point that like people don't talk about King Kong Lives, King Kong Escapes, Son of Kong. I think Son of Kong's actually quite good, and the other two are fine too. I mean, they're bonkers and weird, but there is something about this franchise where somehow there is a break in what audiences are willing to accept in terms of, for lack of a better word, silliness factor. Like with Godzilla, and maybe it's because there were just more movies, so we had more time to let our brains kind of evolve into the idea of Godzilla being a bit more of a Saturday morning cartoon, you know?
Mhm.
But yeah, there's something about like when you watch King Kong Lives, you do kind of go, huh, this doesn't feel like a Kong movie. And I'm not exactly sure what that is exactly. But you're right, it is a thing. And I think Legendary did a great job with Skull Island in returning to this idea of Kong being a sympathetic character. They managed to make him a character that still had like an emotional bond with humans, without just resorting yet again to there's a blonde that he's in love with. I think they did a great job with that.
And I think to your point with that and about why it works, why Godzilla could be more silly, I do think part of that is with Godzilla, because I had a similar origin story to you, Graham. Like, I remember watching those things run on, like, Sci-Fi and, and kind of picking it up piecemeal, seeing them out of order. I was telling Tom, because Tom went through them all much more recently, like the full Godzilla run. And I remember we were talking about the one with Jet Jaguar. I'm forgetting the name of it. You'll certainly know. But
Megalon. Yeah.
Megalon, yeah. And for me, like, as a kid, seeing the movie with Jet Jaguar showing up, and they're all like, Jet Jaguar! And I, watching it on Sci-Fi, it's the 90s, I have no internet to look this up, just assuming for a solid decade that there must have been a massive Jet Jaguar franchise that we just didn't get out here.
Nope.
They just made it. But I think that if you're watching Godzilla as a little kid, right, you are not picking up on the subtext, right? Godzilla is an interesting franchise because you can tell people later, like, if you watch that original movie and you think about the atomic bomb and you think about where Japan was at the time, like, this is actually a deeply, there's a lot going on here. But at least for me, like, when I was a little kid watching Godzilla for the first time, I was like, yeah, this giant lizard creature is showing up and destroying the city. I got it. And then the next movie, I want to watch him destroy the city again. I want to watch him fight monsters because he's a big monster, right? And then you get older and you understand what he represents. Whereas one of the things about King Kong is, as with Godzilla, there's two levels you can watch it at, the kid brain and the adult brain. Kong, there is no missing the message and the tragedy of this movie, right? It wears it on its sleeve so that when what happens to King Kong, you're sad that King Kong died. There's not a party that's like, I want to watch him break more stuff. Because even as a little kid, you understand how sad this is. The most you could ask for with Kong is kind of what you get in Godzilla vs. Kong, the newer one, where it's like, guy just seems tired. Let him just hang
Oh
out on
yeah,
an island.
he's so exhausted.
You don't want to see him go through more. You
Well,
don't
you know,
want to.
I think the tragedy aspect is kind of the biggest thing here. Is that they keep Kong needs to be tragic, but filmmakers kept like they didn't know how to continue the tragedy. So like these remakes, they up the ante of like him being in love with the blonde. Peter Jackson's is just a 3 hour, just like we're gonna torture the shit out of you, making you feel bad for this big old ape, and everybody, and Naomi Watts loves this ape too. It's so sad, and then it's well, all right, well, how do we make Kong tragic in a sequel? Like, what do you even do there? And it kind of took the Warner Brothers era to be like, yeah, he's tragic because he's alone. We're done with this. Like, we're not gonna beat the original. We're not even going to beat Peter Jackson's in terms of the tragic chasing a blonde through New York thing. We have to stop that. Let's find another angle. He's alone. He's his lone species. I also think another difference is just culturally. I think the Japanese culture is much more able to just accept the silliness of the sequels of Godzilla. Where, I mean, you look at the arc of the WB movies. Once King of the Monsters and Godzilla vs. Kong comes out, there's so many people like, oh, these are so stupid. Like, there's no thought to them. They're just nonsense. And you go, well, I mean, yeah, that's kind of just what a kaiju sequel is. It's just big monsters destroying shit. Where I don't know, they made 30 of these in Japan, and nobody really
Well,
was worried about the logic gaps or whatever.
but wouldn't you say, and Graham, you can speak to this much more, obviously, again, you wrote the book.
Yes, he
Part
did.
of this, I think, with Godzilla that you do see is like, there are times, I mean, they crank out a bunch of Godzilla sequels, but there are points in that franchise where they go, okay, hold on, we need to take a break. We need to
Oh, yeah.
retool this. We need to, the 85 movie, we're like, no, he needs to be scary again. I mean, obviously, Shin Godzilla recently is
Hell, even Hedorah.
yeah, those kind of things. Whereas King Kong, I think part of the reason we didn't get that is Son of Kong is kind of like, look, the monkey's cute. Let's have a little fun with this. They just don't crank them out as frequently. So by the time Dino De Laurentiis wants to make King Kong, he's having the same impulse that in '85 the Godzilla team does, which is, you know what? Let's take a step back. Let's retool this. Let's make this more serious. Let's get back to the heart of this. I think the issue is every time they remake Kong, it's two things. One, it's the mentality of, yeah, we got to do this again. We got to make it more serious. And also the trap that so many modern remakes fall into, which is thinking that modern audiences will find this old black and white movie hokey. And in the case of Kong, they don't. There are movies that you can do a modern remake of that hold up, that, because the older movie doesn't hold up, but like King Kong is the perfect refutation of the whole reason the National Film Registry starts is Ted Turner wanting to colorize old black and white movies, right? That's why this happens. Is Ted Turner's going, nobody's going to want to watch Casablanca or Citizen Kane or Mr. Smith Goes to Washington in black and white. He colorizes them, and the colorized movies, rather than bring more people in, look like shit and make the movies worse. It's a bad decision. Kong is one of those cases of like anybody who gets the impulse, I don't know if modern audiences are going to go along with this old King Kong. I think we got to update it and make it this and that. And then you see it and you're like, I'm pretty sure I can still plop a 5-year-old down in front of the 1933 King Kong and he'll be like, good, yes, enjoy it.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are all good points. I think a big part of it too is that, at the time, right, King Kong, it was a stop motion film. Those are very expensive. Those take a long time to make. This was a major effort for the studio for RKO to make this movie. Part of the reason why Godzilla, the original, went, they invented this, they call it suit motion, this idea of men in suits fighting, is because they didn't have the money and they didn't have the time. Now that made sequels very easy to do because they were cheap and they could be done quickly. With Kong, not only the original comes out in 33. I can't speak to the success or failure of Son of Kong. I don't know how well that did. But we've got 20 years now between King Kong and Godzilla coming out, right? Godzilla comes out, it sort of redefines the giant monster thing. They're able to start churning them out because they can be done cheaply. But King Kong, the essence of King Kong is in this stop motion animation. It's a part of it.
Yeah.
they start doing them in like the 60s and 70s in Japan with the suit stuff, but it's different. It's different. And it wasn't really until King Kong, they did the reason why King Kong versus Godzilla happened was because they did a 30th anniversary re-release of King Kong in '63, and Toho, who owned the Japanese rights to King Kong, went, "Oh shit, everybody loves King Kong again. Let's do King Kong versus Godzilla," and that saved the Godzilla franchise. Godzilla franchise was dead in the water, no pun intended, but that is what revitalized that. So I think my point is that with King Kong from the beginning, part and parcel with the emotion of it and the humanity of it and the character of it, it's also the technology of it, and it's the look of it. And I think that was a big part of why it didn't just immediately become a franchise. Because so Todd Browning made the 1931 Dracula. They could immediately start making sequels to that because all they had to do was get the actors back on the sets, throw a cape on him, and let's go. That's why they were able to make 1 million of these Universal monster movies and just turn them out quickly for a lot of money. With King Kong, they just couldn't do that, which in a way kept it kind of sacrosanct. It kept it this kind of special thing that you needed to really invest money into to actually make it right.
And I think to your point, just real quick, Graham, you mentioned re-releases, right?
Yeah.
That's another reason they don't need to make sequels to King Kong that we forget now as modern audiences is pre-television and pre-home video. If Kong made money, and they did this with King Kong, like certain movies you could do this. Gone with the Wind is another example. Like MGM never needed to figure out how do we make Gone with the Wind 2 because they went, oh, if we want to make more money, we just put Gone with the Wind out again. Like King Kong just got so many re-releases. You're like, it's back in theaters. Here's another couple million.
Well, yeah, I mean, people, not to sound like an old man yelling at clouds, but like kids today don't quite understand that like you couldn't go rent King Kong. Like your dad might talk about seeing King Kong, and but you had to wait until somebody re-released it.
To Graham's point about the sacrosanct thing and how you have to take your time to make this movie, I think that's borne out in the fact that Son of Kong comes out the same year as King Kong.
Yep.
It comes out in December of 1933 at a third of the budget of the first one.
What, 60 minutes long, that movie?
Yeah, so they basically themselves proved Graham's point 90 years later, get that script going, Nolan, but they basically made the point, oh, we can't just half-ass this and do it just because people want it. We'd have to take the time and effort to do it. There is no King Kong on screen until 1962 when Toho brings him back to life. They basically made an icon and killed him in the same year.
Well, I mean, the thing is, you do get something like a Mighty Joe Young, which is like Kong.
No, you do.
And
you do.
The other thing that keeps Kong alive is he is parodied so frequently, right? We started this off talking about the iconography, and I think it's important to touch on that again. Like, you've seen King Kong climb the Empire State Building, even if you haven't seen the movie, because so many movies parody it or do it. I mean, I'm thinking about King Kong shows up in Yellow Submarine. He shows up in a million things. My childhood movie theater, part of the reason I love movies so much, we would go to the multiplex out here on Long Island. They had, when you would walk in, a giant neon sign. They don't have it anymore. A giant neon sign of a skyline. And it had a couple of like classic movie images, the Daily Planet for Superman and a couple. And the one that stands out is the giant King Kong on the Empire State Building, all lit up in neon. You learned it from that, or you learned from a million places. But like for me, that's one of those things that I remember looking at that neon sign, and going, right, movies have a history. These images matter. They're part of the cultural lexicon. And I think that Kong could survive not having a movie for 20 or 30 years because you did see Kong stuff. You saw it in Looney Tunes parodies, right? You saw it in TV sitcom spoofs, right? You'd have 90% sure you go to any classic sitcom, somebody at some point mentions King Kong.
I think that's kind of the thing we're talking about, is that this first movie's so good that it didn't need the sequels, but they made a sequel that shows we don't want this half-assed. We don't want you to denigrate this thing. So there's a 30-year gap in between King Kong's next appearance on screen in an original story, not a re-release, not a parody on something else. King Kong getting his own thing, and Godzilla doesn't have that kind of gap, and Godzilla is just as ubiquitous as King Kong. It's like Graham said, this is the kind of property, because Godzilla had for better or worse, a cheaper quality than King Kong. Sometimes those men in suits didn't look that great, King Kong, people didn't want that. That's really all we're saying, and people were okay with just living with that memory of, oh fuck, remember how good King Kong was? Yeah, glad they didn't run that into the ground.
So without further ado, we've talked about King Kong and its legacy, but let's talk about where King Kong was at the time. Tom, how do you think King Kong did at the Academy Awards in its year?
I don't know. Probably got some sound awards, and I don't know. They didn't have like visual effects awards back then, right?
It's always nice, by the way, Tom, when we start this segment and I go, how do you think it did at the Oscars? You go, oh, I don't know. As though I threw this a curveball at you. King Kong was not nominated for any Oscars that year. The Best Picture nominees that year were 42nd Street, A Farewell to Arms, I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, which we covered earlier this season, Lady for a Day, Little Women, The Private Life of Henry VIII, She Done Him Wrong, Smilin' Through, State Fair, and the winner, Cavalcade. So that was what the prestige movies of the time looked like. Obviously, King Kong was a massive hit, but the awards did not want to recognize it, and they made the right call because King Kong is barely talked about today, and everyone knows Cavalcade.
Oh, yeah. Everyone's raving about it down at the local watering hole.
Guys, just so you know, before we got on mic, Graham came on and he was like, I just got the 4K of Cavalcade. Not that I needed it. It's burned into my brain,
I'm so excited. I asked, why aren't we talking about Cavalcade?
Severin Films and Ed Arrow and Criterion are in a bidding war for who's going to be able to release the first 8K disc for Cavalcade.
I was just about to do Severin as the bid.
I should say I know nothing about this movie, so maybe it's probably great. Great.
You know what, Graham? I got news for you. Like I said, we talked about this Oscar ceremony on a previous episode. I'll reiterate my point on that episode. Cavalcade sucks. I try not to be.
He does homework and he watches everything nominated.
That's true. Every episode, I watch the Best Picture nominees that were nominated that year to get a sense of the cinema landscape. I saw Cavalcade forever ago because when lockdown happened, I was like, I guess I should catch up on this 2-week period where we're going to be stuck in our homes. I thought, why don't I watch all the Best Picture winners that I haven't seen? And Cavalcade is. I'm a Fugitive from Chain Gang, if you haven't seen it, is an exceptional film. We covered it earlier this season. I highly recommend it. That movie absolutely rules. And if we were talking about I Am a Fugitive from a Chain Gang, won Best Picture the year King Kong came out, I'd go, I get it. Absolutely. But in this case, good Lord. And it is weird it got ignored in a sense because, like I said, the very first Oscar ceremony, one of the nominees for Best Picture, back when Best Picture was 2 different categories, Chang, a Marion C. Cooper film, was nominated. So it is a little weird that it went unnoticed here, but nevertheless.
Well, as we know, horror and science fiction constantly gets overlooked at the Oscars, so it doesn't surprise me that much that even back then, they would see this and go, it's not highbrow enough for us.
Graham, thank you so much for joining us. This is very cool. I don't want to sound too much, but even back in the first season when we were planning the show, you were when Tom and me and Kyle were brainstorming people we'd love to get on one day. You were on that list, so it's very cool. We managed to make this happen. That feels very exciting for us.
Well, thank you. You're very kind. You're very kind. Thank you.
Just as you can just looking at me, I'm a horror movie genre film guy. Go to Fantastic Fest, so you're obviously a guy that I'm watching at least like 5 movies a year that you're in. So this is very cool. And thank you again for showing up. Plugs. We're going to be doing what would you like to plug today, Mr. Skipper?
I mean, well, first of all, thank you. I've enjoyed being here, and I appreciate all of those kind words very much. I like talking movies with other fellow movie nerds. So thanks for giving me that outlet and inviting me on. And as far as plugging, I mean, get the Blu-ray of Scare Package 2. It's out right now. Get the Blu-ray of The Leech through Arrow Video. The Blu-ray is friggin' awesome. I have some stuff coming up. You can follow me on Twitter at Graham Skipper, assuming Twitter remains a thing. Who knows? And yeah, I don't know. I'm just happy to be, be in this business and be able to meet cool folks like you guys and get to talk about horror movies. I honestly couldn't be happier getting to do this stuff. So thank you.
Well, you're welcome back on a future season for horror, non-horror, whatever you like. I mean, listen, if you have another
Cavalcade.
Yeah.
Yeah, whenever you have the Cavalcade episode, call me back.
Strangely not in the registry yet. I don't know how. But also, if you want to write an entire book about another film that we end up covering or something adjacent, that'll probably narrow it down.
I mean, sure. Yeah, we can do that. Yeah.
I'm assuming your next pitch is to do a book about the 1950s movie Salt of the Earth, right? You're working on that now, and we'll just tie it in, right?
Did I send you an email with that? That's crazy. How did you know
that? Oh,
that?
you accidentally CC'd us.
Yeah.
How did you know that? That's wild. Yeah. It's great. It's going to be a pop-up.
Kyle, edit this out.
Well, Graham, thank you so much for joining us. Everybody else, stick around. We'll be right back with our picks for the National Film Registry.
The National Film Registry isn't some fixed object, frozen in time. It's always growing, adding new titles every year. These annual selections are made by the National Film Preservation Board, with members and representatives from organizations like the Academy, the DGA, and the AFI coming together to debate and decide. But they don't just pull titles out of thin air. They pull from the public, people like you and me, who can submit their nominations for the registry in the form on the Library of Congress's website. What we do, at the end of every episode, is have Mike and Tom pick films not yet in the registry that they feel should be, inspired by that day's topic. At the end of each season, those films will be formally submitted to the National Film Registry for consideration on behalf of You're Missing Out. The only criteria? It must be an American film that's at least 10 years old. Here are today's picks.
So, I'm getting a little clever with this one. So there are rules for the registry. There are mainly two rules. It must be an American film, and it must be at least 10 years old. Now, in our episode, we talked about when it comes to giant movie monsters, it's King Kong, and then the other most famous giant movie monster is Godzilla. But you cannot put Ishiro Honda's 1954 Godzilla in the registry. It's a Japanese film. So how are you going to get Godzilla in the registry? You're not putting the Roland Emmerich Godzilla in there, right? You're not putting the legendary Godzilla in there. If only there was a loophole. Well, folks, I'm here to tell you there is. I do intend to nominate a movie with Godzilla in it, partially directed by Ishiro Honda in the registry. But it's also partially directed by a man named Terry O'Morse. You see, when they wanted to bring Godzilla to America, they didn't just import Godzilla. Instead, Terry O'Morse refilmed scenes to Americanize the movie and had Raymond Burr play an American reacting to the Godzilla attacks and spliced that footage in. They recut it into an entirely new film, just using footage from the Ishiro Honda movie, into an American release called Godzilla King of the Monsters. It is a fascinating film in its own right. It certainly doesn't have the depth or the emotion of the original Godzilla, but what it does have is it represents something that is really kind of purely American and an American tradition that goes on for decades. I mean, Roger Corman, who we talk about sometimes in the show, was also famous for I'll buy this foreign film, bring some guy in to shoot a couple scenes to make it an American movie, right? So I do think that it is more than just being, we could sneak Godzilla in. I do think it is a fascinating thing that there is this movie that got acquired and they felt it had to be recut and redubbed and everything for American audiences. The Japanese actors are dubbed in the bad dubbing of when you've seen Godzilla parodied on TV and the mouths moving differently than what they're saying. That's spoofing not the original Godzilla movies, but the 56 re-edit, King of the Monsters, and all of the new Raymond Burr footage. It's so interesting to watch that movie. I mean, there's a reason why Criterion included both the original Godzilla and the American recut. And in fact, a little weird thing, when they did the Godzilla reboot in the 80s in Japan, to release it in America, they did another recut with Raymond Burr repeating his role from the original Godzilla King of the Monsters. So I think folks should check it out if they haven't seen it. It's a fascinating work of an American-Japanese hybrid and a fascinating re-edit. And I think that for that alone, it deserves a place in the registries. My pick is 1956's Godzilla, King of the Monsters.
I enjoy that pick. That's very nice. I don't like that you said, what am I going to include the legendary Godzilla, legendary versus Godzilla? Because when that's eligible, I'm absolutely doing that.
The only reason I said that is it's not eligible.
Okay, because I will not accept any condescension or disparagement for my big chunky boy, legendary Godzilla. He's a big chunky boy with some hips that don't lie. I'm going pretty straight down the line here. I'm not throwing any curveballs. I'm not being clever. Not being condescending to you being clever with Godzilla. I'm not going to act. I'm just like, sometimes, you know me, I can just find a real weird angle into a movie sometimes, but I'm not doing that here. I am picking Peter Jackson's remake of King Kong. I do genuinely adore that movie. It is a movie, yeah, it's long, I get it. There's things you can nitpick with it, but I think he still has that Lord of the Rings magic in him. It's clearly a movie he cares about, which is, other than documentaries, something we have not seen from him since King Kong came out. It's just, I mean, the James Horner score, again, that Lord of the Rings magic, it's such great music. It looks great, you know, like the original King Kong. Yeah, some of the special effects may not look perfect by today's standards, but they hold up. What Andy Serkis does as Kong is just magical. It's even better than his work as Gollum. And it's a warm-up for his work as Caesar in the Planet of the Apes movies, which is even better than what he did in Kong, which, I mean, holy shit. I think a lot of the things he did, extensions of character stuff, changing some stuff, you know, changing Jack, not from the first mate, but he's the writer of the movie, making Carl more weaselly, sweaty, and venomous than he is in the original, adding just some more dynamics to it. And, I mean, some of that Peter Jackson shit that he puts in, like the fuck, when they fall into the pit and the goddamn slugs start just sucking people up, and you're just like, God, yeah, we forget that this guy used to be a dirtbag horror filmmaker from New Zealand in the 80s and 90s. Like, we forget that this guy, because he has Academy Awards, is essentially just Sam Raimi, but in New Zealand. Jack Black's amazing in it. Naomi Watts is really good in it, adding some depth and humanity to Andara, which is just, to no fault of Fay Ray, is not in the original movie. Adrian Brody, I really like. You know, he's a guy who's had a weird career, and I you know, when he works. It just looks so good, you know, and the adventure stuff, the dinosaur stuff, the New York stuff at the end is just so. It's just so good. I wish this wasn't the last good movie Peter Jackson made. That was not a documentary. But you can tell every inch of this movie is made by a guy who loves King Kong. And not in the way of like a lot of blockbusters today, which are made not by fanboys, but for fanboys. This is a guy who loves this shit, but is enough of a good filmmaker to know when to zig, when to zag, and when to just stay on the path. I think this is one of the great remakes of all time, and I think it just needs to be in, you know, just as the you know, the other side of the coin to the original King Kong.
Let's all go to the lobby.
Thank you again to Graham Skipper for joining us. Next week, we're keeping the Kong chat alive by resurfacing a 2018 episode from our old show. We dive even deeper into Kong's legacy in cinema history as it culminates to his triumphant debut on Broadway. Don't forget to follow the show wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you again next time. Here on You're Missing Out.
They honor movies of historical, cultural, or aesthetic importance on the National Film Registry.